She was just a young architect drowning in doubt, until one wrong hotel room changed her life forever. When she stepped out of the shower and into the arms of a billionaire CEO, their worlds collided, and nothing would ever be the same. Hello, my friends. Before we begin this amazing story, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and how your day is going, all right? And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. The steam, thick and white as a shroud, billowed out into the hotel room as Elena Rossi wrenched the bathroom door open. A thin, starchy towel clutched precariously around her body. The hotel's complimentary conditioner, a tiny bottle of something vaguely floral and entirely useless, had left her dark hair a tangled, rebellious mess. But at least the scalding water had managed to wash away some of the day's profound and stinging humiliation. She could still feel the phantom heat of her boss's dismissive gaze, hear the condescending cadence of his voice as he'd called her latest design a flight of fancy Rossi, not a feasible structure. She mumbled a half-hearted apology to her empty room for the cloud of humidity she was releasing, her mind already racing towards the catastrophic meeting scheduled for 8 a.m. sharp. Her forgotten portfolio, the one tangible proof of her talent and vision, was sitting on the sad particle board desk, her only lifeline. Stepping forward onto what she expected to be the rough, slightly stained texture of cheap hotel carpeting, her bare foot instead met the shockingly cold, impossibly smooth surface of polished marble. The jarring sensation shot up her leg, a jolt of pure confusion that cleared the fog of her anxiety in an instant. Her head snapped up. This was not her room. This was not the cramped, cookie-cutter shoebox overlooking a brick wall that her firm had booked for her. This was a sprawling penthouse suite, a palace in the sky with magnificent floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed the entire glittering, star-dusted panorama of the Chicago skyline. And there, sitting on a starkly minimalist leather couch that probably cost more than her entire year's salary, holding a heavy crystal tumbler filled with an amber liquid, was a man whose face she knew only from the glossy cover of Forbes magazine, Julian Croft, the tech world's most brilliant, enigmatic, and notoriously reclusive billionaire. His eyes, the exact color of storm clouds gathering over Lake Michigan, widened just enough to betray that he was every bit as shocked as she was. The opulent silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the distant hum of city traffic. The air, redolent with the expensive, intoxicating scent of sandalwood cologne and old, well-cared-for leather, filled her senses as the cheap, threadbare hotel towel she was clinging to felt impossibly thin, a pathetic shield against the sheer magnitude of her mistake. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure, unadulterated panic. Her mind, usually a precise and orderly space, filled with blueprints and structural calculations, was now a chaotic whirlwind of disbelief and terror. She remained frozen, a half-draped statue carved from mortification, her bare feet glued to the cold marble floor. Julian Croft simply stared, his expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality that was beginning to crack at the edges. His initial shock was slowly being replaced by a look of intense, unnerving curiosity, his gaze sweeping over her not with lechery, but with the detached, analytical precision of an engineer examining an unexpected variable. He hadn't moved a muscle, still holding his glass of whiskey as if it were an anchor in this surreal tableau. I'm so sorry, Elena stammered, the words catching in her throat, feeling utterly inadequate for the monumental breach of privacy she had just committed. My key card. It must have been a mix-up at the front desk. Room 1208. I'm in room 1208. This is not 1208. She gestured vaguely behind her towards the bathroom she had mistakenly treated as her own, the steam still clinging to her damp skin and hair. She could feel a blush of 1,000 suns creeping up her neck, a fiery tide of shame that threatened to consume her whole. She imagined the headlines, the sheer career-ending scandal of it all. Fledgling architect breaks into billionaire's suite in a towel. Her boss, Mr. Henderson, would not just fire her. He would have her ceremonially blacklisted from every architectural firm from Chicago to Shanghai. He had always warned her that her ambition would be her undoing, and now here was the proof, more absurd and damning than he could ever have imagined. "I can see that," Julian Croft finally said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that seemed to vibrate in the cavernous room. It was unnervingly calm, betraying none of the outrage she had expected. "The peninsula doesn't typically offer rooms of this scale to guests in the 1200 block." He took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink, his stormy eyes never leaving hers, and a flicker of something unreadable, amusement, intrigue, danced in their depths. "The question is, how did you get in? My security is quite thorough." The question hung in the air, a quiet accusation that made Elena's stomach clench. "My key," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "It worked. I was so distracted, thinking about my meeting tomorrow, I didn't even look at the number on the door. I just came in, went straight for the shower. Oh God, I used your shower." The confession tumbled out, a fresh wave of horror washing over her. She hadn't just trespassed, she had used his ridiculously expensive-looking soap. Julian Croft set his glass down on the polished wood of the side table with a soft, definitive click. The sound seemed to break the spell of paralysis that had held them both. He rose from the couch in a single, fluid motion, revealing a tall, lean frame, dressed in a simple dark sweater and tailored trousers that spoke of quiet, effortless wealth. He was even more imposing in person than in the photographs, carrying an aura of intense energy that seemed to be barely contained beneath his composed exterior. "Distracted," he mused, walking slowly toward the massive window, his back to her now as he gazed out at the sprawling city below. Chicago has a way of doing that to people. It's a city of sharp angles and high ambitions. It's easy to lose your focus. The comment felt strangely personal, a subtle acknowledgement of the pressure she was under. For a moment, Elena allowed herself to feel a sliver of hope. Perhaps he understood. Perhaps he wouldn't call security and have her thrown out into the hallway in her towel. "My portfolio," she blurted out, the thought cutting through her panic. "I have to get back to my room. My entire career is in a leather-bound portfolio sitting on my desk." She watched his reflection in the dark glass of the window, seeing the faint outline of his shoulders tensing. "Your career," he repeated softly, turning back to face her. The analytical curiosity in his eyes had intensified, sharpened into something more focused, more calculating. It was the look of a man who didn't just see problems, but saw patterns, opportunities, and unorthodox solutions. He gestured toward a plush armchair opposite the couch. "Perhaps you should sit down, Ms. Rossi," she supplied, her voice barely a whisper. "Elena Rossi." She didn't move. The idea of sitting down, of prolonging this nightmare, was unthinkable. "I really should go." Yet her feet remained stubbornly planted on the cold floor. Julian's gaze held a new weight, a gravity that seemed to pin her in place. "I think you should stay for a moment, Ms. Rossi. It appears we may have a mutual problem." As if on cue, a phone on the coffee table began to buzz insistently, its screen lighting up. With a name, Marcus Thorne. Julian glanced at it, a shadow of profound irritation crossing his features, making his handsome face hard as granite. He ignored the call, his attention returning fully to Elena, his mind clearly working through a complex equation to which she had somehow, impossibly, become the missing variable. The silence that followed the ignored phone call was different, charged with a new kind of tension. The initial shock had dissipated, replaced by a strange, palpable sense of impending negotiation, as if they were two adversaries meeting on a battlefield neither had chosen. Elena finally found the will to move, inching backward toward the door, her hand tightening on the knot of her towel. "A mutual problem?" she asked. her voice laced with skepticism. With all due respect, Mr. Croft, I think my problem, being half naked in a stranger's penthouse, is a little more immediate than whatever is making your phone buzz. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a fleeting expression that did little to warm the cool austerity of his features. The man calling me is Marcus Thorne, he explained, his tone becoming clipped and businesslike. He is a member of my board and my chief rival. He is trying to orchestrate a hostile takeover of my company, Croft Enterprises. His primary strategy is to paint me as unstable, erratic, and emotionally compromised, a leader unfit to command a multi-billion-dollar tech firm. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in. The opulent room. And downstairs, in the lobby, and likely across the street, are a dozen paparazzi, paid by Marcus, waiting for me to make a single misstep. Eleanor's mind struggled to connect the dots. What did any of this corporate espionage have to do with her? I still don't see what this has to do with me, she said, her confusion mounting. I'm just an architect who can't read door numbers correctly. Julian walked over to the wet bar, his movements deliberate and controlled. He poured a glass of water and extended it to her. You are an unknown, intelligent, presentable woman who has just managed to bypass my entire security detail and appear in my private suite, looking flustered. He chose the word carefully. To the vultures downstairs, your sudden appearance could be spun into 100 different narratives. Most of them would be disastrous for me. They could portray you as a secret lover, a corporate spy, a symptom of my supposed instability. Marcus would have a field day. Elena stared at the glass of water, refusing to take it. Her hand was shaking too much. So, you're going to call security, have them escort me out a back exit. I'll sign whatever you want. I'll never speak of this. I swear. Her career was already hanging by a thread. She couldn't afford for it to be publicly incinerated. A scandal involving Julian Croft would be a professional death sentence. No, Julian said, his voice dropping, becoming more intense. That's a defensive move. Marcus expects me to hide, to react. I'm tired of reacting. He placed the glass of water on a nearby table and faced her directly, his storm-grey eyes locking onto hers with an unnerving focus. This was it, the moment the world shifted on its axis. He wants to show the world that I'm unpredictable. Fine. Let's give him something truly unpredictable to choke on. He took a breath, and the words that came next were so utterly preposterous, so far beyond the realm of anything Elena could have ever conceived, that for a moment she was certain she had misheard him, that the steam from the shower had somehow boiled her brain. Ms. Rossi, I have a proposition for you, a business arrangement. For 1 week, exactly 7 days, I need you to be my girlfriend. Elena could only stare, her mouth slightly agape, the sheer audacity of the suggestion rendering her speechless. A laugh, sharp and hysterical, threatened to bubble up from her chest. Girlfriend? Him? Her? It was a scene from a terrible movie, not a real-life event happening in a Chicago penthouse. You cannot be serious, she finally managed to say, the words a mixture of disbelief and indignation. You want me, a total stranger who just dripped water all over your marble floor, to pretend to be your romantic partner? Why? It was a desperate, nonsensical gambit, and she couldn't fathom the logic behind it. Because it's the one thing they won't be able to easily categorize or disprove, he explained, his voice a low, persuasive. It reframes the narrative. I am no longer the reclusive, unstable workaholic. I am a man in a new relationship. It explains my recent distracted behavior. It provides a shield against Marcus's attacks. It's clean. It's simple, and it's temporary. The cold, calculated logic of it was both brilliant and terrifying. He wasn't looking for a partner. He was looking for a strategic asset, a human shield. The thought was deeply unsettling, yet a desperate, treacherous part of her. The part that was about to be unemployed and buried under a mountain of student debt, was listening intently. The humiliation she'd felt in her boss's office that afternoon was a raw, open wound. Henderson had systematically torn apart her project proposal, a design for a sustainable community center she'd poured her soul into, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. "Elena, your ideas are lovely, but they're too ambitious, too idealistic. The world runs on budgets, not dreams." She knew, with a certainty that made her sick, that he would repurpose her core concepts for his own pet project within the year. The sting of that theft, that casual dismissal of her worth, was still fresh. "And what would I get out of this arrangement?" Eleanor asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The sheer insanity of the situation had somehow pushed her past fear and into a strange, detached state of self-preservation. She was already living a nightmare. Perhaps the only way out was to lean into the madness. Her portfolio was still in that other room, a symbol of everything she was about to lose. This man, this impossible stranger, was offering a lifeline, albeit a bizarre and dangerous one. "You mentioned your career is in jeopardy," Julian stated, his gaze unwavering. "You mentioned a portfolio. I assume you're talented, or you wouldn't be fighting so hard for it. At the end of the 7 days, after you have fulfilled your side of the bargain, I will make a call. I will get you a meeting with any top architectural firm in this country. Somm, Gensler, Studio Gang, you name it. I will give you a personal recommendation that will not just save your career, it will launch it into the stratosphere. Your too ambitious designs will be seen by people who recognize their value." He had aimed his offer with surgical precision, striking at the very heart of her deepest desire: professional recognition. A chance to prove that her ideas were not just flights of fancy. He wasn't offering money, not directly. He was offering something far more valuable, a future. He saw her hesitation, the internal war raging in her eyes. "Of course," he added, his voice taking on a harder, more formal edge, "there would be a contract, very strict terms. All public appearances would be scripted and scheduled by my head of security. There would be no personal questions exchanged, particularly about my past. The arrangement terminates at midnight, 7 days from now, at which point we go our separate ways, bound by a non-disclosure agreement with a financial penalty so severe you would not want to even consider breaching it." The offer was laid bare, a week of playing a part in his gilded cage in exchange for her dream. It was a devil's bargain, wrapped in logic and sealed with desperation. Lose her job and reputation, reinforcing every bit of her crippling imposter syndrome, or step into a world of unimaginable luxury and corporate sabotage, pretending to be someone she wasn't. The irony was suffocating. She already felt like an imposter in her own life. What was one more layer of falsehood? She thought of Henderson's smug face, of the pile of rejection letters she'd received before this job, of the crushing weight of her student loans. What other choice did she have? "Okay," she heard herself say, the single word feeling like a leap from a very high cliff. "I'll do it." A flicker of relief, so quick she might have imagined it, crossed Julian's face before the cool mask of control snapped back into place. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. He pressed a button on an intercom on the wall. "Harrison, please come to the suite." A moment later, a tall, impeccably dressed man, with the stoic demeanor of a royal guard, entered the room. He took in the scene, his billionaire employer, a strange woman in a towel, the faint humidity in the air, and didn't so much as blink. "Sir, this is Miss Elena Rossi," Julian said, his tone all business now. "She will be my guest for the next week. Please arrange for her belongings to be discreetly moved from her room to one of the guest suites here, and draw up the standard temporary personal services agreement with the 7-day clause." Harrison nodded. "Of course, Mr. Croft." He then turned his attention to Elena, his eyes professional but missing none of the absurdity of her attire. He extended a thick, leather-bound binder toward her. "Ms. Rossi," the head of security said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You have 6 hours to become the woman Mr. Croft would date. Your first test is tonight." The 6 hours that followed were the most surreal and intensely focused of Elena Rossi's life. The leather-bound binder Harrison had given her was not a style guide, but a military-grade tactical dossier. It contained no fashion advice or makeup tips. Instead, its pages were filled with a dizzying amount of information. A detailed biography of a fictionalized version of herself, complete with a backstory of how she and Julian had supposedly met through a mutual acquaintance at a charity auction for historical preservation. A clever, plausible lie that subtly catered to Julian's hidden passion. There were psychological profiles of every major player on the Croft Enterprises board, with a particularly thick section dedicated to Marcus Thorne, detailing his business history, his known associates, and his preferred methods of corporate attack, which leaned heavily towards character assassination. A meticulously planned schedule for the entire week was laid out, mapping every public appearance down to the minute. The final section was a crash course in media training, focusing on evasive maneuvers for intrusive questions and techniques for projecting an aura of relaxed intimacy in front of cameras. It was a manual on how to construct a person. As Eleanor sat in the cavernous guest suite, a room larger and more luxurious than her entire apartment, she absorbed every word, her architect's mind finding a strange comfort in the structured data and clear objectives. This, she understood. It was like studying a complex blueprint for an elaborate, temporary structure. A woman arrived, not a fawning stylist, but a severe-looking communications coach named Ms. Davenport, who spent 2 hours grilling Elena, firing intrusive questions at her until her fabricated answers sounded natural and immediate. "Where did you vacation last winter, Ms. Rossi?" "Aspen, but Julian prefers the quiet of his lake house." "What is Mr. Croft's greatest fear?" "He would say technological stagnation, but I think it's letting down the people who depend on him." The process was grueling, an exercise in mental gymnastics that left her drained. Finally, a wardrobe consultant appeared with a rack of breathtaking designer gowns, not for a shopping spree, but for a strategic selection. The narrative for tonight's gala at the Art Institute is effortless elegance and intellectual chemistry. The consultant stated briskly, "We need a look that says you are not intimidated by his world, but a natural part of it, sophisticated but not ostentatious. The emerald green, it complements your skin tone and projects confidence." Elena, looking at her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, barely recognized the woman staring back. Draped in a sheath of deep emerald silk that shimmered under the light, her tangled hair now a cascade of smooth, dark waves, she looked the part. But beneath, the polished veneer, her heart hammered with the frantic rhythm of an imposter, a fraud about to take the world's most intimidating stage. Julian was waiting for her in the main living area, dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He looked up as she entered, and for a fleeting moment, the cool, calculating mask slipped. His stormy eyes widened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of genuine surprise, or perhaps appreciation, crossing his features before it was suppressed. "You look appropriate," he said, the word a masterful understatement. "Are you ready?" Eleanor smoothed down the silk of her dress, her hand trembling slightly. "As I'll ever be," she replied, her voice a quiet murmur. "Just try not to look like you're facing a firing squad, Rossi," he advised, a hint of dry humor in his tone. "Remember, we're supposed to be in love." The word hung in the air between them, absurd and strangely heavy, a line from a script they had both been forced to memorize. The Art Institute of Chicago. was a dazzling spectacle of wealth and power, a glittering ocean of couture gowns, bespoke tuxedos, and the subtle, predatory glint of ambition in 1,000 pairs of eyes. The air hummed with hushed conversations and the clinking of champagne flutes, all set against the backdrop of priceless masterpieces. For Elena, it felt like walking into a lion's den wearing a dress made of meat. The moment she and Julian stepped out of the limousine, they were engulfed by a blinding supernova of flashing cameras. Julian's hand instinctively found the small of her back, a gesture that was both reassuringly solid and terrifyingly public. His touch was warm through the thin silk of her dress, a steadying presence in the chaotic storm of attention. "Smile," he murmured, his voice low and close to her ear, the scent of his sandalwood cologne a familiar anchor in the sensory overload. "They're looking for any sign of weakness. Don't give them one." Eleanor forced her lips into a curve that she hoped looked more like genuine happiness than a grimace of sheer terror. They moved through the crowd, a slow, deliberate procession. Julian navigated the sea of influential figures with an effortless grace that belied his reclusive reputation, introducing Eleanor with a simple, confident, "I'd like you to meet Eleanor Rossi." Every handshake, every polite inquiry felt like a test. Elena recited the lines she had memorized, speaking of her architectural background, of their shared passion for sustainable design, of the fictional charity auction where their story supposedly began. To her astonishment, people seemed to believe it. They saw what they were meant to see, the brilliant, enigmatic billionaire finally stepping out with a beautiful, intelligent woman on his arm. The performance was exhausting. The witty banter they had rehearsed felt stilted and awkward in practice. At one point, Julian, attempting a look of adoration, ended up with an expression so intensely serious that Eleanor had to suppress a laugh. "You look like you're calculating the structural integrity of my face," she whispered to him under the cover of a string quartet's crescendo. A flicker of genuine amusement lit his eyes. "Old habits," he whispered back. "I was just noting your excellent symmetry." It was a small, unscripted moment of connection, a brief respite from the suffocating pretense. But the illusion was shattered when a man with silver hair and a smile as thin and sharp as a razor blade approached them, his eyes, the color of faded money, fixed on Elena. "Julian, my boy," the man said, his voice a smooth, venomous purr. "I see you've finally decided to join the land of the living, and you've brought a friend." Julian's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, his hand on her back becoming a rigid brace. "Marcus," he said, his voice flat and cold as steel, "this is Elena Rossi." "Elena, this is Marcus Thorne." Marcus Thorne extended a hand to Elena, his grip firm, his skin cool to the touch. His smile never reached his eyes, which were conducting a swift, dismissive appraisal that made her feel like a piece of furniture he was deciding whether to acquire or discard. "A pleasure, Ms. Rossi," he said, his voice dripping with insincere charm. "It's not often Julian allows anyone into his orbit. You must be exceptional." The word was loaded, a subtle insinuation that she was either a mastermind or a fool. Eleanor felt a chill crawl up her spine, but forced herself to meet his gaze, recalling the dossier's warning about his penchant for psychological games. "Julian has a talent for recognizing potential," she replied, her voice steady, repeating a line Miss Davenport had drilled into her. "In technology and in people." Marcus's thin smile widened. "Indeed, a true visionary." He then turned his full attention back to Julian, the pretense of politeness dropping away to reveal the raw antagonism beneath. "The board is growing anxious, Julian. Your recent eccentricities have—" The investors rattled. "This little romantic escapade is hardly reassuring. It suggests a lack of focus." It was a direct attack, delivered in the middle of a crowded gala designed to provoke a public reaction. Eleanor could feel the tension radiating from Julian, a tightly coiled spring of fury beneath his calm exterior. "My focus has never been sharper, Marcus," Julian retorted, his voice dangerously quiet. And my personal life is, as always, none of the board's concern. He began to steer Elena away, a clear dismissal, but Marcus was not so easily deterred. He waited until Julian was engaged in a conversation with another guest a few feet away, then leaned in close to Elena, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. The scent of his expensive, cloying cologne was nauseating. "I know who you really are, you know," he murmured, his smile turning predatory. "A junior architect from a second-rate firm, about to be fired. Desperate. I do my homework. A word of advice, little girl? Get out. Before he destroys you, too." Julian Croft collects beautiful things, but he eventually breaks all of his toys. The threat was unmistakable, a cold, sharp promise of ruin that left her reeling. Before she could formulate a response, he had melted back into the crowd, leaving her alone with the poison of his words echoing in her ears. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of fake smiles and meaningless conversations, the weight of Marcus's threat pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. The ride back to the hotel was a cocoon of tense, suffocating silence. The glittering Chicago skyline blurred past the windows of the limousine, the city lights looking cold and indifferent. Elena sat rigidly on her side of the plush leather seat, the emerald silk of her dress feeling like a costume she was desperate to shed. The glamour of the evening had curdled into a sour knot of fear in her stomach. Marcus's words played on a loop in her mind. "I know who you really are. Get out, before he destroys you too." The carefully constructed facade of their relationship, already fragile, now felt like it was about to shatter into a million pieces. Julian stared out his own window, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. The calm, controlled mask he wore in public had been replaced by a brooding intensity that was far more intimidating. He hadn't said a word since they'd left the gala, and the silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions and simmering anger. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, a futile attempt to ward off the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a terrible, catastrophic mistake. She had stepped into a war between two powerful, ruthless men, and she was nothing more than a pawn, easily sacrificed. As the car sped down a deserted stretch of Wacker Drive along the river, Julian suddenly spoke to the driver. "Pull over here!" The driver, without question, smoothly guided the limousine to the curb. Julian turned to face her, the dim light from the street lamps casting long, dramatic shadows across his face. His calm facade, the one he had maintained all night, finally cracked. The controlled billionaire was gone, replaced by a man who looked haunted, exhausted and profoundly angry. "There's something about Marcus you need to know," he said, his voice raw, stripped of its usual careful modulation. He was breaking his own primary rule. No personal questions, no past, and the sudden shift in their dynamic was dizzying. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and stared at his hands as if the story was written on his palms. Marcus wasn't just a business rival. We were partners once, years ago. We started a company right out of college. He was the charming one, the salesman. I was the engineer, the creator. We were best friends, brothers even. He paused, the silence in the car now filled with the weight of a long-held betrayal. He sold me out. He stole my original code for a secure data transfer algorithm, sold it to a competitor, and then used a loophole in our partnership agreement to push me out of my own company with nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. He did it all with the help of the woman I was engaged to at the time. Elena's breath hitched. Suddenly, Julian's emotional distance, his cold logic, his reclusiveness, it all snapped into focus. It wasn't an affectation. It was armor, forged in the fires of a devastating personal and professional betrayal. He had built Croft Enterprises from the ashes of that ruin, a fortress of success designed to protect him from ever being that vulnerable again. And now Marcus was back, chipping away at the walls of that fortress. "He doesn't just want my company," Julian continued, finally looking at her, his eyes dark with a pain that looked years old. "He wants to humiliate me. He wants to prove that I'm still that naive kid he can manipulate. By targeting you, he's trying to replay the same game. He wants to isolate me, make me look foolish, and then take everything I've built." His confession hung in the air, a raw, painful truth that changed everything. She wasn't just a pawn anymore. She was the battlefield. To escape the inevitable media storm following the gala, Julian made a swift executive decision. "We're going to the lake house," he announced as the limousine pulled back into traffic. "It's private, secure. The press can't get near it. We'll stay there until the next scheduled event." An hour later, they were miles away from the relentless glare of the city, driving through the dark, winding roads of Lake Forest, a suburb known for its old money estates and secluded mansions. The house was not what Eleanor had expected. It wasn't a modern glass and steel monstrosity, but a beautifully restored historic stone manor nestled amongst ancient oak trees on the shore of Lake Michigan. It was a testament to a different kind of wealth, quiet, enduring, and deeply personal. Inside, the air was still and smelled of wood smoke and old books. There were no assistants, no security guards in sight. It was just the two of them. The atmosphere was a world away from the penthouse's cold, minimalist luxury. Here, every piece of furniture, every painting on the wall seemed to have a story. It was a home, not a showroom. The change in scenery seemed to change him too. Out of his tuxedo and in a simple grey t-shirt and jeans, Julian seemed younger, less burdened. The hard, defensive lines around his eyes softened. He led her to a cozy library with a large fireplace where a low fire was already crackling. "My parents bought this place when I was a kid," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "It's the only place I feel disconnected from all of that." He gestured vaguely in the direction of the city. He then walked over to a bookshelf and pressed a hidden latch. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a small, private workshop filled with architectural drawings, historical maps, and intricate models of old buildings. In the center of the room was a stunningly detailed model of an abandoned historic theater, the same one she had once read about, a landmark slated for demolition. "This is," Elena began, her voice filled with awe as she recognized it, "the Avalon Theater. It's my passion project," he admitted, a sheepish, almost boyish look on his face. "The board thinks it's a financial liability, a sentimental waste of resources, but I think some things are worth saving." He showed her his plans, not just to restore the theater to its former glory, but to integrate sustainable modern technology into its design without compromising its historical integrity. It was a brilliant, elegant fusion of past and future. As he spoke, his voice filled with a passion she had never heard before, Elena saw the real Julian Croft for the first time. Not the cold billionaire from the headlines, but a man driven by a desire to build, to preserve, to create something meaningful. She found herself opening up in return, telling him about her own designs, about her dream of creating buildings that didn't just house people but nurtured communities. She talked about the imposter syndrome that haunted her, the constant crippling fear that her ideas were, as Henderson had said, too ambitious. He listened, truly listened, with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she never had before. He asked insightful questions, challenging her, encouraging her, seeing the genius in the details she was most insecure about. For hours, they just talked, the fake, contractual relationship melting away in the warmth of the fire, replaced by something genuine and unexpectedly profound. The space between them, once measured by rules and pretenses, was now filled with a crackling, unspoken energy. He was standing close to her, pointing out a detail on a blueprint, and she found herself mesmerized by the intensity in his eyes, the way the firelight danced in their stormy depths. The air grew thick, the silence charged. The world seemed to shrink until it was only the two of them, bathed in the soft, flickering light. He turned his head, his gaze dropping from her eyes to her lips, and the carefully constructed walls they had both built around themselves crumbled to dust. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. But she couldn't. She didn't want to. She met him halfway, and his lips met hers in a kiss that was nothing like their scripted performance. It wasn't for the cameras or for a contract. It was hesitant at first, then deepened with a raw, desperate honesty that left them both breathless. It was a confession, a surrender, a moment of pure, unadulterated truth in a week built on lies. There was no turning back. As they finally pulled apart, their foreheads resting against each other, the fragile peace of the moment was violently shattered by a shrill buzz. Eleanor's phone, which she'd left on a side table, lit up the dim room. Her heart plummeted as she saw the notification on the screen. It was a link from a major tabloid, pushed to her newsfeed. Her face was on the cover, locked in an embrace with Julian. But it wasn't a picture from the gala. It was a grainy, long-lens photograph of the kiss that had just happened mere seconds ago, a moment of private vulnerability now broadcast to the entire world. The headline was brutal and screamed in bold capital letters, "Billionaire's new bedmate, corporate spy or gold-digging whore." The image on the phone screen was a brutal violation, a theft of a moment so private and fragile it had barely had time to register as real. The kiss, which had felt like a seismic shift in the tectonic plates of their carefully constructed arrangement, was now reduced to a grainy, pixelated piece of evidence in a public trial by fire. The viciousness of the headline was a physical blow, knocking the air from Elena's lungs, its poison seeping into the newfound warmth that had just begun to bloom in her chest. She could feel the blood drain from her face, the quiet library suddenly feeling cold and hostile. Julian, who had been looking at her with an expression of unguarded tenderness she never thought she'd see, recoiled as if struck. He snatched the phone from the table, his eyes scanning the headline, and the soft vulnerability on his face was instantly replaced by a glacial fury, a cold, hard rage that was terrifying in its stillness. The armor she had seen him shed moments before was slammed back into place, thicker and more impenetrable than ever. "Marcus!" he bit out, the name a curse. He must have had someone watching the house. The implication was chilling. They had never been truly alone. Their sanctuary had been a stage, and their moment of genuine connection was nothing more than ammunition for his enemy. The phone in his hand began to ring, its cheerful tone a grotesque counterpoint to the unfolding disaster. He glanced at the caller ID, his lawyer, and his face became a mask of grim resignation. He answered, his voice once again the clipped, controlled baritone of a CEO in crisis mode. "David?" "Yes, I've seen it. How bad is it?" Eleanor watched him pace in front of the fireplace, the flames casting his tense silhouette against the wall. She couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she could read the verdict in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the way he pinched the bridge of his nose, a gesture of a man bracing for impact. The conversation was short, brutal, and clinical. When he hung up, he didn't look at her for a long moment, instead staring into the fire as if searching for an answer in the dancing flames. "The board has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "Citing the morality clause in my leadership contract and behavior indicative of extreme instability. Marcus has spent the last hour calling every member, forwarding them the article. David says they have the votes, Elena. It's over. He's going to force the merger, and they're going to vote me out of my own company." The finality in his tone was like a door slamming shut on their future, on his future, and as if the universe had conspired to orchestrate the perfect symphony of their mutual destruction, her own phone began to vibrate in her hand. The caller ID displayed a name that made her stomach turn to ice. Mr. Henderson. With a shaking hand, she answered. She didn't even have a chance to speak. "Rossi!" Her boss's voice barked, sharp and utterly devoid of sympathy. "I hope you're proud of yourself. My phone hasn't stopped ringing. We have clients threatening to pull contracts. You've made this firm a laughingstock. Pack up your desk. You're fired. A courier will be by in the morning with your final check and a severance agreement that includes a non-disparagement. Clause you'd be very wise to sign." The line went dead. Elena stood in the magnificent silent library, the phone slipping from her numb fingers and clattering onto the antique rug. Fired. It was all gone. In the span of 5 minutes, Julian was about to lose his empire, and she had lost the very career she had made, this impossible bargain to save. Marcus Thorne hadn't just won. He had scorched the earth, leaving nothing but ashes. The fake relationship had culminated in a very real, very public ruin. The journey back to the city was a funereal procession. The fragile intimacy forged by the fireside had evaporated, replaced by a chasm of failure and regret. They sat on opposite sides of the car, two strangers once again, bound not by a contract of pretense, but by the shared wreckage of their lives. Harrison met them at the hotel penthouse, his stoic expression for once showing a flicker of concern. Julian retreated to his office without a word, the door closing behind him with a heavy, definitive thud, leaving Elena standing alone in the cavernous living room that had become the stage for her downfall. The next morning, she returned to her office, a cardboard box in her hands, to face the final humiliation. The open-plan workspace, usually a hive of quiet industry, fell silent as she walked in. Every head turned, and she could feel the weight of their stares, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and contempt. Her desk had already been partially cleared, her personal effects piled unceremoniously to one side. As she began to pack her few belongings, a framed photo of her parents, a collection of architectural reference books, a coffee mug, the weight of her imposter syndrome came crashing down on her with the force of a collapsing building. Marcus was right. Henderson was right. She was a fool, a desperate girl who had flown too close to the sun and had her wings melted away. She was nothing more than a flight of fancy, too ambitious and idealistic for a world that ran on. Power and pragmatism. Her gaze fell upon the large, glossy renderings pinned to the main presentation wall. It was Marcus Thorne's vision for the new skyscraper, the centerpiece of the hostile merger. It was being celebrated in the news as a bold new addition to Chicago's skyline. Most of her colleagues looked at it with admiration, but Elena, even through her haze of misery, saw only its flaws. Her eyes, trained to see the bones of a structure, to understand the delicate dance of tension and compression, scanned the design. It was flashy, ostentatious, all gleaming surfaces and dramatic angles, designed to impress investors, not to stand the test of time. Her gaze drifted over the public schematics, detailing the foundation and the core support structure. And then she saw it. It was a detail so small, so deeply buried in the technical specifications, that 99 out of 100 architects would have missed it. A specific grade of steel specified for the load-bearing beams was subtly, almost imperceptibly, below the standard required for a building of that height and wind load exposure in the Chicago area. It was a cost-cutting measure, cleverly disguised by a complex and flashy cantilever design that distracted the eye. But she knew. She knew that under the right conditions, a severe winter storm, a high-velocity wind sheer off the lake, the structural integrity would be compromised. The building wasn't just a fraud, it was a potential catastrophe. A whisper escaped her lips, cutting, Through the silence of her thoughts, wait a minute. The fog of her despair began to clear, replaced by a cold, sharp, crystalline focus. They had taken her job. They had destroyed her reputation. They had humiliated her. But they could not take away her competence. They could not take away what she knew. With a newfound sense of purpose, she pulled out her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard, cross-referencing building codes, running preliminary stress calculations, and digging into the public records of Thorne's listed materials suppliers. She had nothing left to lose and a skyscraper's worth of fraud to expose. The Chicago Architecture Center's annual conference was the most prestigious event in the industry. The main auditorium was packed, a veritable who's who of the architectural world. Elena, dressed in a simple, professional black suit she'd bought with the last of her savings, stood at the back of the room, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. On stage, bathed in the warm glow of the spotlight, was Marcus Thorne, delivering the keynote address. He was at the zenith of his triumph, his voice booming with confidence as he presented his grand vision for the Thorne Tower, the very project he had used to leverage his takeover of Croft Enterprises. Behind him, massive, breathtakingly rendered images of the skyscraper filled the screen. In the front row, she could see Mr. Henderson, her former boss, looking up at Marcus with an expression of sycophantic admiration. Elena had spent the last 24 hours in a caffeine-fueled frenzy, compiling her findings into a concise, irrefutable report. She had analyzed every blueprint, every materials manifest, and found a pattern of dangerous, fraudulent shortcuts. She had sent it all to Julian in a single encrypted email with the subject line, "The real reason for the merger." Now, all she could do was wait and hope he'd seen it, that he'd understood. Just as Marcus was reaching the crescendo of his speech, a side door to the stage opened. A figure walked out of the wings and into the spotlight. It was Julian Croft. A gasp rippled through the auditorium. Marcus faltered mid-sentence, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. Julian calmly walked to the podium, took the microphone from its stand, and faced the audience. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, his voice calm and steady, yet commanding the absolute attention of every person in the room. He turned slightly, his gaze finding Elena in the back of the hall. "But first, I need to publicly apologize to someone. Ms. Elena Rossi." He looked directly at her, and the entire audience turned as one. "I made a selfish, desperate decision and pulled her into a world of public scrutiny and corporate warfare that she did not deserve. The malicious rumors circulated about her are completely false. A calculated attack by a man who has a history of using people as collateral. She is a woman of immense integrity and talent, and I am profoundly sorry." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. In that moment, he wasn't a billionaire or a CEO. He was a man taking responsibility, clearing her name in the most public way imaginable. Then, he turned his attention to Marcus, his expression hardening. "Mr. Thorne's vision for his tower is indeed impressive," Julian stated, his voice ringing with authority. "But a better one already exists, and more importantly, a safer one." He gave a subtle nod to a technician. In the wings, the massive screen behind Marcus flickered. The gleaming render of the Thorne Tower vanished, replaced by a clean, elegant, breathtakingly beautiful design. It was Elena's sustainable community center, the one Henderson had called a flight of fancy. A murmur of appreciation spread through the crowd of architects. "And as for Mr. Thorne's design," Julian continued, his voice cold as ice, "there are a few things you all should see." The screen changed again, now displaying a schematic of the tower's core structure. A red circle highlighted the substandard steel specifications. Julian, using Elena's own meticulous analysis, began to systematically, clinically, and publicly dismantle Marcus Thorne's fraudulent project, pointing out every fatal flaw, every dangerous shortcut, every lie. He exposed the entire project as a house of cards, a public menace disguised as progress. He didn't just defend Elena. He used her genius to prove her value, transforming her from a public victim into the public hero who had just saved the city from a potential disaster. The aftermath was pandemonium. As the full weight of Julian's accusations sank in, the auditorium erupted in a cacophony of shocked whispers and urgent phone calls. Marcus Thorne stood frozen on the stage, his face ashen, his empire of lies crumbling around him in the glare of the spotlight. His career was over. Julian's board members, who were present in the audience, were already huddled together, their expressions a mixture of horror at the fraud they had nearly endorsed and profound relief. Julian's position was no longer in question. He had just saved the company from a disastrous and fraudulent merger. Amid the chaos, Julian walked off the stage, his eyes searching for only one person. He found Elena near the exit, the stunned silence that had enveloped her finally breaking. The validation, the sheer, overwhelming triumph of the moment was so potent it made her dizzy. Mr. Henderson intercepted her before Julian could reach her, his face a pathetic canvas of shock and regret. "Rossi, Elena, I had no idea," he stammered. "Your design, it's brilliant. We would be honored to have you back to lead the project." Elena looked at the man who had dismissed her, who had cast her out without a second thought, and felt nothing but a quiet, satisfying pity. "No, thank you, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I think I'll be exploring other opportunities." She walked past him, her head held high, and met Julian halfway. The space between them was electric. All the contracts and pretenses burned away in the fire of the last week, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of their connection. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "No," he corrected her, his stormy eyes soft with an emotion she now recognized as genuine admiration. "We did it." Before they could say more, a well-dressed woman approached them, introducing herself as the head of the city's planning commission. "Ms. Rossi," she said, her expression one of deep respect. "What we saw on that screen was more than just a beautiful design. It was a vision for the future of this city. We are officially rescinding all permits for the Thorne Tower, effective immediately, and we would be honored to discuss fast-tracking your project." In that moment, Eleanor knew her life had changed forever. She had not only won back her career, she had claimed her voice, her vision, her power. Later that evening, after the storm had passed, she and Julian stood on the balcony of the penthouse, the glittering Chicago skyline spread before them like a promise. The contract was broken, the 7 days cut short by the implosion of their shared crisis. They were free. "So," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "What now?" Julian turned to her, his hand finding hers, his touch no longer a performance, but a simple, profound truth. "Now," he said softly, "we start over. No contracts, no rules, just us." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, gentle kiss filled with the promise of a beginning, a foundation built not on desperation, but on mutual respect, admiration, and something that felt an awful lot like love. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air whipped around Elena as she stood on the bustling construction site, a white hard hat perched firmly on her head. The skeletal framework of a magnificent building rose behind her, its elegant, sustainable lines already a testament to the vision she had fought so hard for. Her vision. She was no longer a junior architect, but a lead partner on the most celebrated new project in the city. She watched the crew's work, a deep, abiding sense of satisfaction warming her from the inside out. A familiar presence came to stand beside her, and she leaned into Julian's side without taking her eyes off the rising structure. He was a constant, solid presence in her life now, a partner in every sense of the word. He slid an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "It's going to be beautiful," he said, his voice filled with pride. "I never doubted it for a second." she replied, tilting her head back to look at him. He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, elegantly framed object. Inside the frame, mounted on a piece of black velvet, was a simple plastic hotel room key card from the peninsula. Chicago, a symbol of the absurd mistake, the catastrophic accident that had somehow led them both to exactly where they needed to be. Elena laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. "You kept it. It's the key that opened the most important door of my life," he said softly, his eyes sincere. He leaned down and captured her lips in a kiss filled with the easy intimacy of a shared life and the promise of a future they were building together, from the ground up, their partnership once. A desperate contract was now built on the most solid foundation of all,